Hello world, long time no see. This video is divided into two sections. For those of you who came here for the content about Luria's The Working Brain, I will do that first. And if you're still interested in me or this channel, stay for a couple of more minutes to hear me talk about it a little. Without further ado, what a YouTube thing to say. Let's jump right in. In 1973, Alexander Luria published a book called The Working Brain, An Introduction to Neuropsychology. As neuropsychs, we all know that Luria is the father of neuropsychological assessment. I won't talk too much about him in this video, unless you want me to make another one dedicated to him. The first part of the book is titled Functional Organization and Mental Activity. I think this is an excellent narrative of how, historically, people attempted to conceptualize the brain and how the heck it works. Let me talk you through it now. The chapter started off by asking the scariest question. How does the brain cope with the reception, analysis, and storage of the information coming from the outside world? And how is it structured or functionally organized to program, regulate, and verify the entire complex of consciousness so that we can achieve our goals? In response to this, Luria noted that people didn't even understand the brain enough to be asking this question. Originally, the brain was thought of as a reactive system where each of the external stimuli has its own neurocorrelates, so that the very presence of the stimulus activates the neuron, which produces what people call experience. Back in the days, this was enough for an explanation. It wasn't until many decades later that people began to recognize the insufficiency in the theory's scientific rigor. The approach Luria took was to provide a summary of principles that can introduce some order in our understanding of cognitive function and mental activity. This brings us to Chapter 1, Local Brain Lesions and Localizations of Functions. As soon as you see the title of Localizing Functions, you cannot forget to think about the phrenology guy, Franz Joseph Gall. Actually, we shouldn't dismiss him so fast. Apparently, he was the first to describe the difference between the grey and white matter. I mean, really, he should be famous for that too. But back to phrenology. Simply speaking, that refers to the idea that human faculties are located in particular and strictly localized areas of the brain, which can be identified by observing prominences in different parts of the skull. If you were wondering, the kind of functions Gall was interested in were stuff like love of life, confidence, and attraction to wine. I mean, seriously. We now know that that's not the whole story. But his approach really inspired many others, like Broca and Wernicke. Again, simply speaking, Paul Broca was the dude that saw a patient who pretty much lost expressive speech due to damage to the posterior third of the inferior frontal gyrus, now known as the Broca's area. And Carl Wernicke was this other dude who saw someone who lost the ability to understand audible speech due to damage to the posterior third of the left superior temporal gyrus. These are significant discoveries following Gall's time because they really lend support to the localization theory. So people became absolutely fascinated by the prospect of potentially mapping the entire brain for their localized function. The assumption was that, and I'm quoting Luria here, mental activity can be localized in circumscribed regions of the cerebral cortex, just like elementary functions. Soon this movement was referred to as narrow localizationism. Now, what's a history without some drama, hey? Here comes our crisis. An English neurologist guy called Hewlings Jackson began to challenge this widely endorsed, essentially ubiquitous belief about neuroscience and argue that cerebral organization of complex mental processes must be approached from the standpoint of the level of their construction rather than that of their localization in particular areas of the brain. Again, quoting from Luria. Now, before we dive into revealing what the levels are, Luria digressed a little and invited us to reconsider what function even means. Stay, this is really important. The idea was that with narrow localizationism, what we're trying to do is connecting a function with just a single or very narrowly defined piece of brain. However, this stops making sense when we think of an example of function such as digestion. Because the act of digestion involves 1. Transportation of the food to the stomach, 2. Processing of the food with gastric juice, 3. Having the liver and pancreas secrete stuff to process the food, 4. The walls of the stomach and the intestine also had to contract, 5. The food would be pushed into the digestive tract, 6. Small intestine absorbing the processed component of the food before it becomes poop. So it doesn't really make sense for us to try to associate a function as complex yet basic as digestion to a single piece of body tissue. And the same idea applies to mental activity too. What a function needs is a complete functional system. And this is where things about the brain gets complicated, because each cog about the system is scattered all over the brain. In other words, a function is defined as the presence of a constant task performed by variable mechanisms, bringing the process to a constant result. It is also important to remember that a functional system always includes an adjusting/afferent and effector/efferent impulses, so basically a feedback loop between the internal and external worlds. It is this idea that prompted the re-examination of localizationism and the promotion of network approach. This basically takes us to Chapter 2 of Part 1, titled The 3 Principal Functional Units. We're finally here, and I'll only briefly summarize the conclusions here because students today are already pretty familiar with the concept, and it really is beyond the scope of this video to cover the details of current findings and all the nuances that exist within each unit. Heck, I'm not even sure if I fully understand all of them. The first unit is for regulating tone or waking. This unit is basically associated with the brainstem and the diencephalon. As we now know, they look after our breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, and several other functions that pretty much determine if we were alive or dead. Therefore, Luria described this Therefore, Luria described this unit as regulating the state of the cerebral cortex, changing its tone, and maintaining its waking state. The second unit is for obtaining, processing, and storing information arriving from the outside world. This unit is associated with the lateral regions of the neocortex, including the occipital, temporal, and parietal regions, as well as each of their primary and secondary/associative cortices, wherein the primary cortex is comprised with neurons that respond to their own modally specific type of stimuli, such as line that is oriented a certain way. And the secondary cortex is comprised with associative neurons with short axons that integrate whatever sensory information input. There was an added concept of tertiary cortex, which was argued to be responsible for enabling groups of several functional networks to work harmoniously together. These zones lie on the boundary between the occipital, temporal, and postcentral cortex. It is also what distinguishes humans from animals. The third and last unit is for programming, regulating, and verifying mental activity. This unit is associated with Surprise, surprise, the frontal zones of the brain. It distinguishes itself by having a rich system of connections with virtually the whole brain, both on cortical and subcortical levels. And that concludes the first part of the book. Now, if you made it this far into the video and got a few minutes spare to hear me ramble on about something a little more personal, sit back and grab a cup of tea or wine, what have you. So, for 6 months, I've been absent from this channel because I couldn't figure out a more efficient way for me to communicate to the YouTube audience, and my first few videos didn't really meet my expectations either in terms of its production, even though they each took me an entire day to make. The process was frustratingly tedious, and that was taking up too much of my time to study. But just last night, I accidentally discovered that one of the student societies followed my Instagram account and even credited one of my posts. Honestly, that gave me such a dopamine boost. So I scrambled onto my phone, downloaded Instagram, and yes, I didn't and never really have Instagram on my phone just because I cannot be trusted with it. Anyway, I logged onto the Neuron et al. Account and found, well, I gained like 22 more followers, including the student society, and now have 64 followers. No, it's not sad that I'm excited, and I don't care how many of my current followers are ghost accounts. Honestly, it gave me the motivation to make this video. The thing is, I want to remain anonymous still, even though one of you guys already recognized me through my voice, but I'm sure they will help me remain invisible. So I was thinking, how do I make the process of producing content smoother for me? I like to read about neuropsychology, and getting to share what I know makes the whole thing even more exciting. And then I figured, how about if I try filming myself doing something relaxing without showing my face, and y'all can just look at that while listening to me nerding out about the brain. The idea is to paradoxically combine intellectually rich auditory input with something we might associate with unwinding. What's unwinding for me? Well, reading is unwinding for me. Watching Friends and Big Bang Theory as well. But you don't want to look at me staring into Netflix, do you? I happen to have some origami strips lying in my drawer, so that decides what I would do. I'm definitely not a pro. Definitely struggle a little bit sometimes, but hey, that's me. This is an experiment, okay? It may or may not work. We'll see how we go. Okay, I'll let you go now. Thanks for listening. Bye.